The dawn of the 16th century marked a period of immense transformation across Europe. The intellectual upheaval of the Renaissance had begun to unsettle long-held traditions in art, philosophy, and science. It was within this environment of cultural ferment that ANDREAS VESALIUS was born in Brussels on December 31st, 1514. His birth into a well-educated, medical family would shape the path of a man who would later revolutionize the study of human anatomy. Vesalius's family background was steeped in medical service. His father, ANDREAS van Wezel, served as an apothecary to Emperor Charles V and descended from a line of physicians. This proximity to the imperial court and medical institutions exposed Vesalius to a world in which knowledge was both preserved and challenged. From a young age, he was immersed in the vocabulary of science and medicine, likely cultivating an early interest in the human body and its mysteries. Growing up in Brussels, which at the time was part of the Habsburg Netherlands, Vesalius was influenced by the city's intellectual and cultural richness. The Low Countries were centers of commerce and scholarship, and their universities attracted thinkers from across Europe. It was here that Vesalius received his early education in classical languages and liberal arts, subjects considered essential for scholarly pursuits during the Renaissance. The foundations of his education were built on the humanist tradition, which emphasized the return to original sources and direct observation, principles that would later become central to his work. He studied Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, equipping himself to read classical texts in their original forms. This linguistic ability would later enable him to critically examine the anatomical works of ancient authorities like Galen. In 1530, Vesalius enrolled at the University of Leuven, where he began formal studies in the arts and sciences. Leuven was one of the most prestigious universities in the region and provided a strong curriculum in Aristotelian philosophy and logic. Although these subjects were largely theoretical, they instilled in Vesalius a methodical way of thinking that would aid his future scientific investigations. From Leuven, he moved to the University of Paris in 1533 to pursue a medical education. Paris was a major hub of medical thought at the time, although its teaching remained bound to tradition. Students were expected to memorize the texts of Galen and other ancient authorities, often without ever examining a human body firsthand. It was in Paris that Vesalius began to question this approach. He grew frustrated with the discrepancy between the descriptions in Galenic texts and the actual structures he observed in animal dissections. Despite the limitations of medical training in Paris, Vesalius's skill in dissection set him apart. He began performing dissections himself, sometimes resorting to stealing bones from cemeteries to study human remains more closely. These early acts of academic defiance foreshadowed his later insistence on empirical evidence over dogma. He believed that understanding anatomy required direct engagement with the human body, not passive absorption of inherited knowledge. The political climate in France forced Vesalius to return to Leuven in 1536, where he completed his studies before enrolling at the University of Padua in Italy, an institution known for its progressive approach to science. Though this part of his journey lies ahead, his time in Leuven and Paris had already shaped a young scholar deeply skeptical of unchallenged authority and passionately committed to observation and truth. It is important to recognize that Vesalius's early years were not marked by rebellion for its own sake, but rather by a profound desire to understand the human form more accurately. His rejection of blind adherence to tradition stemmed from the Renaissance ideal of ad fontes, back to the sources, which emphasized rediscovery through direct contact with original material. For Vesalius, this material was the human body itself. The tall, arch halls of the University of Padua echoed with voices of inquiry and dissent. It was here, in the intellectual cradle of northern Italy, that ANDREAS VESALIUS arrived in 1537, his youthful eyes alight with ambition. The city was a mosaic of winding canals and crowded market squares, where students from all over Europe gathered, drawn by the university's reputation for fostering innovation. Unlike other institutions still tethered to medieval methods, Padua encouraged questioning, experimentation, and the pursuit of first-hand knowledge. The atmosphere was electric. In anatomy theaters, students sat in rising tiers, surrounding marble tables where cadavers were laid out for study. The air was thick with the scent of wax and alcohol-soaked linens, mingling with the tension of anticipation. For Vesalius, these rooms became sacred spaces, not for religious ritual, but for scientific revelation. He would not simply listen to lectures. He would become the lecturer, scalpel in hand, unveiling the secrets hidden beneath the skin. Under the mentorship of renowned scholars like Johannes Guenther von Andernach, Vesalius honed his technical skills and deepened his philosophical understanding of the body. His hands moved with increasing confidence, separating muscle from bone, tracing the delicate paths of nerves and veins. Each dissection brought clarity, not just of the body's architecture, but of the misleading assumptions passed down for generations. At Padua, Vesalius was no longer a passive student. He was becoming a master of his craft. The university's library, rich with manuscripts and rare books, became his second sanctuary. Hours were spent poring over ancient texts, some crumbling, others freshly printed, written by Hippocrates, Avicenna, and of course Galen. Yet these readings did not pacify his mind, they stirred it. Vesalius began creating annotated margins, sketches on loose parchment, and comparative notes that highlighted discrepancies between written anatomy and what his own eyes observed on the dissection table. Outside the classroom, Vesalius was a man of obsessive habits. He collected bones, not for morbid fascination, but for study. He gathered skeletons from charnel houses and remote graveyards, assembling them in his quarters like puzzle pieces. Vertebrae were sorted by curvature, skulls compared for symmetry, and rib cages reassembled with the care of a craftsman. The human skeleton was not merely an object of interest. It was a map, and he was determined to learn how to read it. His methods were not without controversy. The use of cadavers, often sourced from executed criminals, raised ethical concerns even in liberal Padua. But Vesalius, driven by a hunger for truth, dismissed accusations of impropriety. He believed the dead could serve the living by illuminating the intricacies of life. Where others saw desecration, he saw education. This moral tension would follow him throughout his life. But in these formative years, it only hardened his resolve. Vesalius's lectures quickly gained fame. Crowds filled the anatomical theater to watch this young professor dissect bodies with precision and flair. Unlike his contemporaries, who often relied on assistants to perform dissections, Vesalius did the work himself. He narrated his actions in real time, inviting students to see, to think, and to challenge. His words flowed as smoothly as a scalpel cut, drawing connections between theory and practice with a clarity that was both rare and captivating. By the time he earned his doctorate in medicine later that same year, Vesalius was already reshaping the landscape of anatomical education. He restructured how anatomy was taught, replacing the traditional separation of lecture and dissection with a unified, hands-on approach. Students no longer memorized diagrams. They engaged with the living blueprint of the body itself. It was a radical departure from tradition, and it drew both admiration and resentment. But Vesalius was not content with academic success alone. He began preparing detailed anatomical charts, illustrations of muscles, bones, and organs that would serve as educational tools. These drawings, produced with the help of skilled artists, were not only accurate, they were beautiful. The body, he believed, deserved to be understood in both scientific and aesthetic terms. Art and medicine, in his mind, were not separate disciplines but complementary languages. As he stood one evening by the candlelight of his small studio, reviewing a sketch of the thoracic cavity, Vesalius could feel the momentum building. His ideas were no longer confined to the walls of Padua. They were seeds scattered on the wind, ready to take root across Europe. The growing stack of manuscripts and sketches on ANDREAS Vesalius's work table stood not merely as a record of observation, but as a quiet act of rebellion. As he refined his diagrams and cross-checked bodily structures with his own notes, a profound realization emerged. The anatomy taught in Europe for over 1,000 years was riddled with errors. These weren't the minor discrepancies of different interpretations. They were fundamental flaws, stemming from a single towering figure, Galen of Pergamon. Galen, the Greek physician of the Roman Empire, had become a virtual oracle of anatomical knowledge. His writings were revered, studied, and treated as sacred by generations of scholars. Yet Vesalius began to see that Galen's descriptions, while detailed and methodical, did not match the human body that lay before him in dissection. The conclusion was as bold as it was dangerous. Galen had never dissected a human body. The ancient Roman prohibition against human dissection had forced Galen to rely on animals, monkeys, pigs, and oxen, for anatomical study. While many structures are similar across species, they are not identical. Vesalius noted, for example, that Galen had described a liver with 5 lobes and a bone in the heart, features common in animals but absent in humans. These discoveries chipped away at the stone pedestal on which Galen's authority stood. As Vesalius uncovered more discrepancies, his skepticism turned into conviction. He began to mark up Galen's texts with sharp annotations, circling errors and scribbling corrections. For Vesalius, anatomy could no longer be a discipline based on citation and commentary. It had to be a science grounded in observation, experiment, and the evidence of the senses. This belief marked a radical departure from the scholastic traditions that dominated medieval medicine. In the lecture halls of Padua and beyond, this shift did not go unnoticed. While many students were captivated by Vesalius's clarity and courage, some professors were outraged. They saw his corrections not as progress, but as arrogance. To question Galen was, in their eyes, to question the entire lineage of medical wisdom, an affront to the hierarchy of knowledge built over centuries. The tension between innovation and orthodoxy thickened like a storm cloud over Vesalius's growing reputation. Outside the university, the cultural and religious atmosphere of Europe made such challenges all the more precarious. The shadow of the Inquisition loomed over intellectual life, and any suggestion of heresy, scientific or spiritual, could have dire consequences. Vesalius was acutely aware of this. He did not present his findings as an attack, but as a necessary correction, a return to truth discovered through the body itself, rather than through inherited dogma. Still, the dissonance could not be ignored. In each dissection, Vesalius stood at the crossroads of 2 worlds, one built on authority, the other on evidence. He often imagined the long-dead Galen working by oil lamp, tracing the ribs of a Barbary ape, unaware that his words would become gospel. Vesalius did not blame him. He blamed the centuries of blind repetition that had turned science into scripture. In his private writings, Vesalius began to sketch out the structure of a new anatomy, one that would correct Galen's errors and rebuild human understanding from the inside out. He envisioned a comprehensive volume, filled with detailed illustrations and explanations, rooted entirely in first-hand observation. But he knew that such a work would not merely inform. It would provoke. And yet, Vesalius was no mere contrarian. He respected the giants on whose shoulders he stood, even when he had to disassemble their work to see clearly. He was motivated not by ego, but by an unshakable commitment to truth. His dissections were not acts of desecration, but of devotion to the human body as it was, not as it had been imagined. In the quiet moments between lectures and dissections, Vesalius often walked the narrow streets of Padua, deep in thought. The cool breeze carried the scent of ink and candle wax from his studio, mingling with the distant murmurs of students and scholars. The scent of burning herbs, mixed with the metallic tang of blood, lingered in the air as the velvet curtains were drawn back. In the center of the anatomical theater, under flickering candlelight and the eyes of an expectant crowd, stood ANDREAS VESALIUS. Clad in a scholar's black robe, his hands poised with the calm precision of a surgeon, he prepared to peel away the layers of myth wrapped around the human form. These public dissections were not mere demonstrations. They were spectacles of knowledge, orchestrated to challenge and enlighten. The anatomical theater in Padua was unlike any other space in Renaissance Europe. A circular amphitheater, its ascending tiers brimming with students, physicians, nobles, and curious onlookers, was designed to focus all attention on the dissection table below. The arrangement was intimate and intense, a stage upon which the mysteries of life and death would be unwrapped. Vesalius transformed this space into a living classroom, where science was not whispered in secret, but declared aloud with knife and voice. Each dissection began with ceremony. The cadaver, typically the body of an executed criminal, was laid upon a wooden table scrubbed clean, yet forever stained by its purpose. Assistants brought in iron tools, tallow candles, and pitchers of water. Vesalius would step forward and address the crowd, his voice steady, carrying the weight of conviction. With practiced ease, he would make the first incision, often at the chest, revealing the hidden complexity of human architecture. But the real drama was not in the gore. It was in the contradiction. Vesalius spoke of Galenic descriptions and then pointed to discrepancies in the flesh before him. An artery that should have branched one way branched another. A muscle described as triangular was in fact fan-shaped. The audience, many of whom had memorized Galen's texts, watched in stunned silence as their certainties were cut away layer by layer. Vesalius's teaching style was both methodical and theatrical. He did not rush. He narrated each movement, each discovery, explaining the function of organs, the interdependence of systems, and the elegant design of the human body. His tone was never flippant, even when challenging long-standing beliefs. He treated the cadaver with solemn respect, as if acknowledging its role in furthering the understanding of all humanity. What set these public dissections apart was not just Vesalius's clarity, but his transparency. He invited scrutiny, welcomed questions, and encouraged debate. He often handed instruments to students, guiding them through the tactile experience of learning. He believed that anatomical knowledge could not be passed down like folklore. It had to be earned through observation and touch. In doing so, he redefined the relationship between teacher and student, master and apprentice. The sessions could last several days, depending on the body's preservation and the weather. Heating was minimal, and the scent of decay became part of the learning environment. Despite the discomfort, attendance only grew. Scholars traveled from distant universities to witness what some began to call the Vesalian method. His reputation swelled across Italy and beyond, not as a rogue, but as a reformer, a man pulling medicine out of darkness into light. Among the audiences were artists, intrigued by the anatomical detail that might enhance their own craft. Some even sketched alongside Vesalius, trying to capture the real dimensions of bones and muscles. This cross-pollination of science and art added another layer to the dissections, enriching both disciplines. Anatomy, once locked away in dry tomes, was becoming a visual language accessible to many. Not everyone celebrated these events. Rumors spread that Vesalius defied divine law, that he tampered with souls, that his dissections bordered on blasphemy. But Vesalius, though cautious, remained undeterred. He countered that the body was a divine creation and that to understand it was a form of reverence. For him, ignorance was a far greater sin than inquiry. The scent of parchment, ink, and oil paint filled the small studio where ANDREAS VESALIUS labored deep into the Venetian nights. Shadows of anatomical sketches hung across the candlelit walls like ghosts of discovery, their fine lines etched with obsessive care. Here, surrounded by drawings, manuscripts, and skeletal remains, Vesalius embarked on his most audacious project, to write a book that would redefine anatomy for generations to come. He envisioned not a mere compendium of medical facts, but a complete anatomical atlas, text and image unified to speak a new, more truthful language of the human body. His work would be called De Homini Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. The title alone was a challenge to tradition, suggesting that the human body was a machine, a structure to be examined and understood in mechanical terms, not mystical ones. Vesalius knew that words alone would not suffice. If he was to overturn centuries of anatomical error, his findings needed to be seen as well as read. He turned to the finest artists and engravers of his time, seeking minds that understood not only the contours of the body, but the Renaissance ideal of merging science and beauty. It is widely believed that some of the illustrations were done by artists from the workshop of Titian, whose mastery of human form was unparalleled. Together, they produced more than 200 woodcut illustrations, each a masterpiece in its own right. Muscles were depicted in layers, with figures shown in dynamic, almost theatrical poses against natural landscapes. The body was not only exposed, but animated, presented as both scientific subject and work of art. These images were not background, they were argument. They told the truth of anatomy more powerfully than any sentence could. The text, written in precise Latin, was just as revolutionary. Vesalius structured the book in 7 volumes, each focused on a different system of the body: bones and joints, muscles, veins and arteries, nerves, digestive organs, the heart and lungs, and finally, the brain. The organization itself was a departure from earlier chaotic collections of body parts. His anatomy followed a logical, almost architectural sequence: foundation first, then structure, then function. Writing the Fabrica was a painstaking process. Vesalius revised constantly, cross-referencing texts, revisiting dissections, and redrawing diagrams until every part aligned. He measured bones by hand, confirmed muscular attachments through fresh cadaver studies, and meticulously labeled each vein, nerve, and ligament. The book became a mirror of his mind, precise, curious, and uncompromising. To ensure the quality of the printed work, Vesalius traveled to Basel, Switzerland, where the best printers of Europe operated. There he supervised the typesetting and engraving process personally, refusing to delegate responsibility. He inspected each proof sheet, correcting errors and adjusting image placements. The fusion of text and image had to be flawless. This was not just a book, it was a statement of truth. Finally, in 1543, De Homini Corporis Fabrica was published. The first edition was monumental in scale, a folio-sized volume that commanded physical presence. Bound in rich leather and embossed with gold, it felt more like a sacred tome than a scientific manual. Every page invited awe, each image, each paragraph a quiet revolution. Vesalius sent a copy to Emperor Charles V himself, a bold move that showed both confidence and ambition. The gesture paid off. The emperor was impressed, and soon Vesalius was summoned to serve as imperial physician. His book had not only captured the attention of the scientific world, it had caught the eye of Europe's most powerful ruler. Yet Vesalius knew that prestige was no shield against controversy. Even as praise poured in, so did criticism. Some scholars accused him of arrogance, others of error, and many of outright heresy. But the Fabrica was not a whisper that could be silenced. It was a thunderclap. The marble corridors of the imperial palace in Brussels echoed with footsteps of diplomats, generals, and courtiers, but now among them walked a figure of a different kind: ANDREAS VESALIUS, physician not by inheritance or nobility, but by mastery of the human form. Fresh from the triumph of De Homini Corporis Fabrica, Vesalius had entered a world far removed from the anatomical theaters of Padua. The court of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was a stage of grandeur, where politics and power moved like a hidden current beneath the formal elegance. Appointed as the emperor's personal physician, Vesalius found himself surrounded by a host of seasoned advisors and ambitious medics, many of whom viewed him with suspicion. He was young, bold, and had already disrupted centuries of established knowledge, qualities that did not endear him to those who favored protocol and deference. Yet Charles V, a monarch deeply concerned with his failing health, recognized in Vesalius not only talent but truth. The physician's steady hand and fearless thinking had impressed him, and so Vesalius was granted a place few ever reached: close proximity to the body of the empire itself. His duties, however, were far removed from the academic clarity of Padua. As court physician, Vesalius was responsible for treating the emperor's ailments, which included chronic gout, digestive complications, and periods of deep fatigue. These were not dramatic, surgical challenges, but slow, complex battles of management and precision. Vesalius monitored the emperor's diet, adjusted medicinal concoctions, and supervised treatments rooted in both contemporary practice and the ancient traditions he had once challenged in writing. Despite the elevated status, the court was not an easy environment. The scrutiny was constant, and the political stakes immense. A misjudged dosage, a misunderstood symptom, could ripple into scandal or even fatal consequence. Vesalius had to temper his scientific zeal with diplomacy, often choosing caution over confrontation. In this new setting, the scalpel was not the most dangerous tool. Words were. Whispers moved quickly, and a single misplaced opinion could undo a career. Still, Vesalius adapted. He learned to navigate the hierarchy of nobles and clerics, to speak the language of both medicine and empire. He observed, quietly, how power treated illness, not as a natural phenomenon, but as a threat to authority. The body of a ruler was a symbol, and its decline could unsettle entire regions. Vesalius's role became not just to heal, but to preserve stability, to cloak vulnerability behind the veil of wellness. During his years at court, Vesalius also continued his writing and correspondence, albeit in a more constrained fashion. The intense dissection work of his early career gave way to more theoretical reflections. He consulted on medical cases across the empire, advised noble families, and became a sought-after authority across Europe. Still, he often longed for the tactile truth of the dissection table, for the clean certainty of muscle and marrow over the murky intricacies of royal politics. Occasionally, he was summoned to battlefield camps or plague-stricken towns, where his skill in trauma care and diagnosis proved invaluable. In these moments, Vesalius returned to the raw urgency of medicine. He treated arrow wounds, managed fever outbreaks, and even performed emergency amputations, tasks that reminded him of the physician's true calling. These episodes, though brief, reconnected him with the roots of his vocation, far from the perfumed corridors of palace life. At court, however, his reputation continued to grow. He was lauded not just as a healer, but as a symbol of Renaissance thinking, a man who had taken on ancient texts and emerged with knowledge drawn from experience, not tradition. His presence at imperial events, alongside generals and cardinals, marked a quiet revolution. The physician as intellectual, not just servant. Vesalius represented a new kind of authority, one grounded in evidence. And yet, the court was not a place to grow. It was a place to maintain. Vesalius, who once dissected bodies before hundreds in pursuit of understanding, now spent long evenings writing letters, refining court prescriptions, or sitting silently in the emperor's chambers. The fire of discovery, though not extinguished, had dimmed beneath the weight of imperial duty. The golden glow of court life began to dull for ANDREAS VESALIUS, replaced by a mounting sense of unease. Though he had risen to prominence and earned the emperor's favor, his position offered no immunity from the persistent undercurrents of suspicion and resentment. Beneath the polished marble of imperial palaces and the velvet drapes of noble salons, whispers had begun to circulate, whispers questioning not only his methods, but his morality. At the center of these whispers lay a single, haunting accusation: that Vesalius had dissected a body that still held signs of life. The specifics were vague, the location uncertain. Some said it had occurred during a private autopsy at court. Others insisted it happened in a remote town on imperial business. Regardless of the facts, the implications were dire. In an era where the line between science and sacrilege was perilously thin, such an act could brand a man not as a physician, but as a murderer. The allegations struck at the very heart of Vesalius's identity. He had always treated the dead with reverence, seeing each dissection as a solemn act of inquiry, not desecration. Yet the charge had spread swiftly, carried by envious rivals and conservative factions who had never forgiven him for appending Galenic doctrine. To them, Vesalius's devotion to the body was unnatural, even heretical, an affront to divine order disguised as scientific pursuit. Despite his protests, the cloud of controversy deepened. Some ecclesiastical authorities began to question whether Vesalius's dissections, so vividly illustrated in his Fabrica, were born from curiosity or arrogance. They pointed to his illustrations, bodies posed as if in life, muscles bared in dramatic landscapes, and asked whether he sought knowledge or glorification. Such imagery, they argued, bordered on blasphemy, reducing sacred vessels to spectacle. The court, always wary of scandal, grew cold and silent. Even Charles V, though still supportive, was increasingly withdrawn due to his deteriorating health. Without the emperor's active protection, Vesalius found himself more vulnerable than ever. His peers grew distant. Some avoided him altogether, while others watched with careful detachment, weighing whether to defend or denounce. Vesalius retreated inward, troubled not just by the accusations, but by the realization that his greatest work had made him a target. His letters from this period, though guarded, hinted at spiritual unrest. He questioned the cost of his ambition, the price of challenging centuries of accepted wisdom. The same hands that had drawn back the veil of ignorance were now seen by some as instruments of darkness, seeking to clear his name, or perhaps to escape the gathering storm. Vesalius turned to Rome, the center of both religious authority and learned inquiry. He hoped to find allies among the higher clergy, perhaps even among the physicians of the papal court, who had respected his work from afar. But in Rome, too, the atmosphere was tense. The Counter-Reformation was tightening its grip, and the Church's tolerance for unorthodox thought was rapidly thinning. To deflect attention and demonstrate piety, Vesalius made a dramatic decision. He would undertake a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Such a journey, arduous and fraught with risk, was not expected of a man of his stature. Yet for Vesalius, it offered a chance for spiritual cleansing, for reprieve from the political and religious machinery that had ensnared him. He would trade the court for the desert, the scalpel for silence. His departure was abrupt. Leaving behind his manuscripts and most of his instruments, Vesalius boarded a vessel bound for Jerusalem. He wrote little of his motives, but those close to him sensed a man torn between worlds, between science and faith, fame and isolation, certainty and doubt. The physician who had once dissected death to understand life now sought in holy places what Europe had denied him: peace. The sea stretched endlessly before him, a vast and shifting mirror that seemed to reflect the turmoil within. ANDREAS VESALIUS stood at the bow of the ship, his physician's robes exchanged for simpler garments, the salt-laden wind whipping through his hair. The journey to the Holy Land was not only a geographical crossing, it was a descent into uncertainty, an inward voyage shaped as much by memory and remorse as by compass and sail. The Mediterranean voyage was arduous. The ship, a creaking vessel bearing dozens of pilgrims, groaned beneath the weight of souls searching for penance. Among them, Vesalius was both anonymous and set apart. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in soft, measured tones. Gone was the confident lecturer of Padua, the eloquent court physician. In his place stood a man weathered by public scrutiny and personal doubt, his gaze turned inward more often than outward. As the ship made landfall at the port of Jaffa, the land of ancient prophets rose before them, dusty, golden, and sun-drenched. Jerusalem was still miles away, perched in the hills beyond the coastal plains. Vesalius, unused to the harsh terrain, took to the road with the other pilgrims, their path winding through arid valleys and rocky escarpments, past olive groves and scattered ruins of civilizations long crumbled. With each mile, he left behind the world of manuscripts and medicine, stepping into something older, more elemental. In Jerusalem, The old city greeted him with its labyrinthine alleys and the murmured prayers of many faiths. He visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, joining throngs of pilgrims kneeling in reverence. But for Vesalius, the sacred stones held more than symbolic meaning. They were silent witnesses to a kind of suffering and healing that no textbook could explain. He touched the walls with trembling hands, as if hoping they could absorb the weight of his past. Though surrounded by devotion, Vesalius remained introspective. He walked the Via Dolorosa not as a physician, but as a man seeking atonement. He spent hours in quiet chapels, gazing at flickering candles and wondering whether his pursuit of knowledge had come at too high a cost. Had he, in stripping the body bare, lost sight of the soul? The question lingered like incense in the air, unanswered but ever present. He journeyed beyond Jerusalem, visiting Bethlehem, Nazareth, and even the Dead Sea. The landscapes were alien and ancient, their silence deeper than any libraries. Here, without anatomical charts or imperial duties, Vesalius was free to simply observe, not bone or blood, but life in its rawest forms. He watched shepherds tending their flocks, children playing in sun-drenched courtyards, and old women drawing water from wells, all etched in the same quiet dignity that he had once sought in the human body. In these travels, he began to keep a private journal, not of anatomical findings, but of impressions, parables, and reflections. His entries were sparse but poignant. Thoughts on mortality, humility, and the balance between knowing and believing. They hinted at a man slowly reconciling the scientist with the seeker, recognizing that truth might wear many faces, some carved in flesh, others in silence. Yet the journey also took a toll. The heat was relentless, the food scarce, and the roads treacherous. Vesalius, unused to such privation after years of courtly luxury, grew thin and weary. A persistent cough began to plague him, and a fever crept into his bones. Still, he pressed on, determined to complete his pilgrimage, not only in body, but in spirit. He was chasing not absolution, perhaps, but understanding. It was during the return leg of the journey, on the island of Zakynthos, that his strength finally gave out. The ship he had boarded was forced to dock after storms battered its hull. Vesalius, already weakened, collapsed shortly after arrival. Local monks took him in, offering what care they could. He was lucid for several days, speaking softly in Latin and occasionally in his native tongue. Witnesses described his manner as serene, though his eyes betrayed an inner storm that never fully passed. On that quiet Ionian island, far from the libraries of Padua and the palaces of Brussels, ANDREAS VESALIUS breathed his last. His final resting place was modest, marked only by a simple stone and the prayers of strangers. Long after the body of ANDREAS VESALIUS was laid to rest beneath the olive groves of Zakynthos, the tremors of his life's work continued to echo across the world. His hands had ceased their delicate dissections. His voice no longer echoed through lecture halls, but the truths he uncovered, truths drawn from sinew and skull, lived on in parchment and print. With the Fabrica, he had not only rewritten the map of the human body, he had redrawn the very boundaries of medicine itself. In university libraries from Venice to Vienna, copies of De Humani Corporis Fabrica were pored over by a new generation of physicians. These young scholars, many of whom had grown up in the shadow of Galenic orthodoxy, now opened the great folio volumes to find not myths, but mechanisms, not dogma, but demonstrable fact. Where once they had memorized flawed diagrams of invisible vessels and imagined organs, they now encountered precise renderings of the body's architecture, shaped by Vesalius's hand and confirmed by their own observation. The influence of Vesalius rippled outward, inspiring not only physicians, but artists, philosophers, and even theologians. In his images, the human form was no longer cloaked in mystery. It stood as a testament to divine craftsmanship and the power of reason. Painters began to depict the body with renewed accuracy. Sculptors studied anatomy not as abstraction, but as reality. His dissections had shown that truth was not blasphemy. It was beauty in its most honest state. In the decades following his death, Vesalius's methods were adapted, and expanded upon. The rise of empirical science in Europe owed much to the trail he had blazed. Anatomists began to question older sources, turning instead to the cadaver itself as the ultimate authority. Universities slowly shifted from rote recitation to experimental learning. Medicine, once bound by tradition, was becoming a living, evolving discipline. Still, Vesalius's legacy was not without its complexities. Some critics, particularly in more conservative academic circles, saw his work as the start of a dangerous erosion of classical knowledge. The idea that observation could supplant inherited wisdom challenged the foundations of not just medicine, but many other disciplines. Vesalius became a symbol, admired by some, reviled by others, for a broader intellectual shift, one that placed inquiry above reverence. As centuries passed, the myth of Vesalius grew alongside his reputation. Romanticized biographies depicted him as a lone hero defying a world of ignorance, while others painted him as a tragic figure undone by the very knowledge he pursued. Yet the truth, like the body itself, was more intricate. He was a man of contradictions, faithful yet defiant, meticulous yet passionate, a scientist who sought certainty in flesh but also yearned for meaning beyond it. During the Enlightenment, his work was cited by figures like William Harvey and Albrecht von Haller, who built upon his anatomical foundations to chart new physiological territories. Even as medical science evolved with new instruments, from the microscope to the stethoscope, Vesalius remained a central reference point, a pioneer whose insistence on first-hand observation had changed the standard of evidence. In the 19th and 20th centuries, medical schools across Europe and the Americas preserved editions of the Fabrica as prized relics of their profession's birth. His illustrations were displayed not only in textbooks, but in museums, their elegant woodcuts revered for both scientific clarity and artistic merit. The drawings that once shocked and dazzled now served as historical anchors, reminders of the moment when medicine began to see the body not as theory, but as truth to be uncovered. Modern historians came to view Vesalius not simply as a rebel, but as a bridge between worlds, the medieval and the modern, the theological and the empirical. His work helped to humanize medicine, transforming the patient from an abstract case to a complex being made of tissue, experience, and emotion. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for the doctor not merely as healer, but as observer, interpreter, and lifelong learner. Time, like a slow-turning page, eventually blurred the details of ANDREAS Vesalius's life, but it never erased his presence from the margins of history. Long after his bones had crumbled into dust, his name continued to echo through lecture halls, inscribed in bronze plaques, etched into old parchment, and whispered among those who sought truth in the folds of the human body. He was no longer simply a man, nor just a physician. He had become a symbol of courage, of defiance, of knowledge wrested from the jaws of dogma. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Vesalius was shaped and reshaped by the needs of the age. During the Renaissance, he was hailed as the embodiment of a humanist ideal, one who bridged art and science with equal fluency. Enlightenment thinkers cast him as a rationalist trailblazer, casting off the chains of superstition. To modern medicine, he became a patron saint of evidence, the figure who placed the scalpel into the hands of reason. Yet the myth of Vesalius was never static. Artists imagined him standing in candlelit chambers, bent over pale cadavers with divine clarity in his eyes. Writers spun tales of him being persecuted by shadowy inquisitors, exiled for truths too pure for the world. These stories, embroidered and embellished, often strayed from fact, but they spoke to a deeper truth, that Vesalius's life had become a kind of anatomy in itself, a body composed of history, imagination, and longing. His birthplace, Brussels, eventually claimed him as a native son. Statues were raised in his honor, and streets were named after him. Museums displayed his likeness beside ancient instruments, while universities used his name as a mark of prestige. Vesalius halls, Vesalius programs, Vesalius medals. Yet the man himself remained distant, elusive, always glimpsed through the fog of reverence. Few remembered the quiet boy who once wandered the halls of Louvain, or the weary pilgrim who breathed his last on a forgotten island. In recent decades, renewed interest in Vesalius has drawn scholars to explore not just his achievements, but the inner world behind them. Letters, marginalia, and early drafts of his texts reveal moments of doubt, awe, and solitude. Far from the infallible genius he was often painted to be, Vesalius emerges as deeply human, driven by purpose, yes, but also haunted by the enormity of what he sought to understand. He didn't merely dissect bodies. He dissected belief, tradition, and the limits of perception. Today, as medicine surges into the digital era, guided by artificial intelligence, robotic surgery, and genetic mapping, the image of Vesalius seems almost quaint. In the sterile glow of high-tech operating rooms, his presence still lingers. Every surgeon who charts a nerve, every student who identifies a vertebra, owes a quiet debt to the man who first insisted that to know the body, one must see it, touch it, open it. He gave permission to ask dangerous questions and to follow them wherever they led. In a world increasingly defined by speed and abstraction, Vesalius's work is a reminder of the tactile intimacy of discovery. His woodcut illustrations, once cutting-edge, now feel almost sacred in their detail. They invite the viewer not to rush, but to study, to trace the path of a tendon or the curve of a rib with reverence. They remind us that knowledge is not always loud or fast, but often quiet, deliberate, and carved from patience. Even in popular culture, Vesalius's shadow falls long. Novels, films, and documentaries revisit his story, each finding in him a mirror for their own time. The rebel scholar, the tragic seeker, the unsung hero. His name has been invoked in debates about ethics, education, and the role of science in society. And with each invocation, the question he posed, what is the truth of the body, is asked anew in ever more complex forms. As the final pages of his legacy continue to be written, one thing becomes clear. ANDREAS VESALIUS was not merely a man of his time. He was a man who stepped outside of time, who peeled back the skin of assumption to reveal something eternal. Not just muscles and bones, but the enduring need to understand ourselves. And in that pursuit, he achieved a kind of immortality that neither scandal, nor illness, nor death could erase.